Creatures of the Night by Robert Eastland, read by Blackman.
It was somewhere around midnight when Kathy decided that she'd made a big mistake letting Michael camp out with his friends. She sat bolt upright in bed, wondering what on earth had possessed her. All right, there were 3 of them, and Maybury Park was only round the corner. But they were only 11 years old, and it suddenly seemed horribly quiet out there. She crossed the bedroom, pulled the drapes aside, and looked out of the window. Oh, how deserted the town was at this hour. Absolutely nothing moved. The yellow glow of the street lamps seemed to create more dark spaces than light ones. In gardens, under trees, in the many narrow alleyways linking one street to the next. Even the cars were immovable objects, sleek and gleaming, but full to their brims with blackness and rooted to the curbs. Drawn curtains on the windows of the neighbours' houses cut them off too, the beings inside lost in their voids of sleep, utterly unreachable. The stillness of it all was tangible. Kathy imagined you could draw a knife through it and hear its fabric ripping. And then, of course, there was the silence. It covered everything like a quilt. For a moment, Kathy dithered by her curtain. Michael would probably sulk for days, not so much because he'd been suddenly denied a night's camping out, but because of the humiliation in the eyes of his school friends. She wondered what Bill would have said had he still been living at home. Probably something macho and empty-headed like, "This is the sort of thing lads of his age get up to," or, "When I was a lad, we used to go camping in the Brecon Beacons, never mind the town park." She could just picture him as he said it, slouched in front of the TV, beer in one hand, a doorstep-thick cheese sandwich in the other, his eyes fixed on the screen. That decided her on the matter. She whipped her nightie off, climbed into her jeans, and pulled on a sweatshirt and an old pair of pumps. Anything her ex-husband thought okay was definitely a big no-no. That path had always led to disaster. It was a dry, clear night, but cool for September, so she put on her mac and scarf before venturing outside. When she stepped from the porch, however, she was still having second thoughts. Not so much now for her young son's safety, but for her own. Since the divorce 2 years ago, she'd hardly ever been out at night, except at weekends, when the town was alive with revellers, and even then in the company of friends. A midweek night like this suddenly seemed very lonely. More to the point, the house she and Michael lived in was large and detached, with extensive gardens around it. Access to Ashwood Lane was via the drive, which ran for 20 yards through trees and bushes. At this time of night, they were a formless, leafy mass, offering many a dark place for any would-be attacker to hide in. Kathy hung back. She could always get the car out of the garage, she supposed, but it hardly seemed worth it with the park only 5 minutes' walk away. After a moment, she steeled herself and went boldly down to the road. This was a pretty safe neighbourhood. It was an official home watch area, and they were a long way from the town centre where the most dangerous hooligans tended to hang out. For a main trunk road, however, Ashwood Lane was unnervingly quiet. It ran off into the far distance in either direction, bereft of cars or pedestrians. She stood at the bottom of the drive for a moment, gazing along the lane to a distant junction controlled by traffic lights. They changed, steadily and repeatedly. Monotonous, serving nobody. Spooky, that. She turned and began to walk the other way, coming quickly to the corner of Maybury Close. The park was down at the far end of it. Kathy jammed her hands into her mac pockets and glanced over her shoulder before setting off down towards it, and was forcibly stopped in her tracks. Her heart missed a beat. Just for a moment then, way down Ashwood Lane, she fancied she'd seen the figure of a man stepping quickly into someone's driveway. Cathy stood there trembling. Had she or hadn't she? There was certainly no sign of anyone now, but then there wouldn't be if he'd just ducked out of sight. Cathy carried on swiftly down Maybury Close, a little disconcerted. There'd be nothing in it, whoever he was. He was probably just going home. Ducked out of sight, indeed. More likely he'd just been entering his own driveway. Not that that explained the odd look of the man. Cathy tried to tell herself that she'd only caught a momentary glimpse of him, but she'd still been given the impression of a very long coat, almost ankle length in fact, a briefcase, and thick straggling hair hanging down over his back and shoulders. There'd also been a beard, she thought, a dark, unkempt beard. Cathy was certain of one thing: she knew nobody in this neighbourhood who looked like that. Still, it wasn't worth dwelling on. She looked over her shoulder again all the same. She saw nobody else and heard nothing more until she reached the bottom end of Maybury Close and walked over to the park. A dull, distant light was flickering far out in its pitch-black depths. Michael and his friend's tent. Maybury Park wasn't a park as such, more an open green space between housing estates, planted with elm trees and the odd flower bed. When Michael had first told her the plan, she'd never considered that there could be any danger there. They'd be surrounded by houses, after all. But at this time of night, they seemed a long way from anyone. The light was a pinpoint in the shadows. Cathy walked more quickly towards it. The grass was already soaked with dew and littered with early leaves. Cathy realized that her breath was smoking. Then she wondered why she was rushing. Even when the tent's triangular shape came into view, she felt panic. The light was on inside it, but it threw no shadows on the canvas. There were no sounds of horseplay either, or boyish laughter. Cathy found herself running. In front of the tent, she could now see a litter of crisp bags and empty pop bottles. Without a word, but panting hard, she ripped the flap back and stuck her head inside. All three of them were in there, curled up in their sleeping bags. Her sudden intrusion brought them awake with loud cries of fright, however, then groans of disbelief. "Michael," she said firmly, "come on, please, we're going." He was about to protest, but she gave him her hardest look, and sullenly he began to get his stuff together. Cathy was surprised at the ease of her victory. She'd expected at least some resistance. As it was, he was now pulling on his anorak and hiking boots and rolling his bits and pieces up in his sleeping bag. The other two boys watched him in silence, pop-eyed with sleep, faces chalk white and sickly from the unaccustomed exposure to the night air. Only when she closed the flap on them did they begin to talk together, a furtive, mumbled conversation. "Thanks, Mum," said Michael, stumping off ahead of her. "I knew this would happen." But he still didn't put up the real fight he was capable of. As she followed him, Cathy thought she knew why. She glanced around. The trees were black stanchions silhouetted against the distant glow of the streetlights. Here, under the elms, the shadows were thick and bottomless, and made it difficult to see your own hand in front of your face. It was easy to think you'd be brave in the daylight hours. Things changed at night, of course. Unwittingly, she'd given him the excuse he'd been looking for. Then a flicker of movement caught her eye. She stopped sharply, grabbing Michael by the shoulder. He winced and pulled away and was about to say something when he saw her expression. She was staring hard to her left, eyes straining to penetrate the dark. "What?" he asked, rubbing his shoulder melodramatically. "Nothing," she said after a moment in a tight voice. "Let's get on. It's very late." She was damned if she was going to tell him she thought she'd just seen someone ducking out of sight behind one of the tree trunks. Fleetingly, the thought struck her that now it was wrong to leave the other two lads behind. But her motherly instincts were working full tilt. Getting Michael to home and safety first was a priority. She felt the urge to put an arm around his shoulders as they walked, but knew he'd shrug it off. They reached the pavement without incident and struck off along it, but Cathy could sense that vast, lightless space of parkland behind them, and the echoes of their footfalls seemed horribly loud. So loud, in fact, that they'd surely never hear someone creeping up on them. "Soon be home now," Cathy said. Michael grunted, as if that was all he needed. It was only a 5-minute walk away, but Cathy was now thinking about the numerous drives and gates they had to pass first, about the numerous parked cars and vans with the unseen niches between them, about the numerous low walls overhung with densely leafed branches. How little light the sodium yellow lamps actually gave off when it came down to it, she realised. They were halfway up Maybury Close when there was a sudden, violent crash from somewhere behind them. Both jumped, and despite herself, Cathy looked round. She half hoped to see someone locking their car in a garage, or putting the cat out of the side door. There was nobody there, however, and no telltale lights, either outside or inside any of the houses. "Almost there," she told Michael, hoping he wouldn't notice the shake in her voice. Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw a face, waiting just around the side of a house, watching them with a horrible expression. Cathy drew air in through clenched teeth. She tried not to scream, and in that same instant realised that it was only a garden statuette, a cherub dancing in the middle of someone's back lawn, now framed in an open side gate. It leered out at them as they passed. "Why'd you come and get me?" Michael suddenly asked. "The others' mums aren't bothered?" "I just had second thoughts, that's all," Cathy replied. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "There's no one else about, you know. I'm certain we'd be all right." He spoke in an irritable, patronising tone. They'd said nothing else to each other for a minute or so, and came to the corner with Ashwood Lane, where Cathy slowed down and stopped. Michael looked up at her questioningly. "We waiting for a bus or something?" he asked cheekily. "Just a minute," she said sharply. She moved to the corner and looked round it. As before, the road was deserted, the ever-changing traffic light a sentinel shape at the far end. Their own drive was only 50 or so yards along, but now they were close to where she'd thought she'd seen that weird, bearded guy. Cathy realised that all along, this was what she'd most feared, getting back to the house. Whatever the atmospheric effects and figments of her own imagination had contrived to do to her on the way to and from Maybury Park, getting back to Ashwood Lane was never going to have provided comfort, because she knew for a fact that there really was someone hanging around there. But where the hell was he now? Still down the far end? Or hiding somewhere a little closer? She looked back along the road. It was still bare of life. The entrance to their own drive was tantalizingly close. Their own drive, with all those bushes and trees along it. That would be an ordeal in itself. "There's nothing here," he told her loudly. Now there was a note of real aggravation in his voice. "Why don't we just go home?" She still made no reply, and with a sigh of annoyance, he set off on his own. "Michael!" He started violently and turned quickly round. She took him by the arm and led him back to the street corner. "Listen, darling," she said quietly. I think there is someone." And then she told him. She told him all about the strange figure in the long coat, about the thick beard and wild frenzy of hair, about the way he was loitering and clearly didn't want to be seen. To her surprise, however, Michael didn't look even remotely afraid. He stared at her as if she was an idiot. "That's Dr. Smelly," he said after a moment. "Dr. Smelly?" Cathy was baffled. Michael nodded. Oh, he's a sort of tramp. He's always hanging around. Surely even you've heard of him. Cathy shook her head. Michael looked up to heaven in disbelief. Where have you been? He walks around every night. Who exactly is he? From what she'd so far heard, she didn't exactly approve, but she still felt a little better. Putting a name and a face to the unknown entity was always reassuring. She began to edge her way along the street. They said he used to be a doctor down at the infirmary, Michael explained, tagging along. You know, a surgeon. They say someone died while he was operating on them, and he went bonkers. He's been walking about ever since. Everyone says that he's trying to work up the courage to do another operation. He's supposed to carry all his equipment round in that case with him. He's all right, though. He looks scary, but a few of us have even spoken to him. People should want to help him, not run away from him. They'd now reached the drive entrance, and Cathy looked up at it. It would have helped, she realised, if she'd put the outside lights on. Darkness hung over the porch like canvas. Michael marched straight up, however, and warily she followed. She didn't dare look sideways, but could easily picture a ragged, long-haired figure standing there under the trees, a coat buttoned down to his ankles, the leaves and twigs rustling as he shuffled slowly towards her, now dappled with silver streaks of moonlight which revealed dank, lice-infested hair, and the face of a maniac, eyes livid, teeth bared, shuffling towards her. No, floating, ghost-like, not making a sound, right up behind her, hair rippling around his head like serpents. Cathy came up against the front door, sweating hard. She turned the key quickly and opened up. Michael walked jauntily in. She looked back. The drive was now deserted, and she'd of course known it would be. She shook her head at the curse of her own vivid imagination and locked up behind her. A few minutes later, they were upstairs and getting ready for bed. Michael switched his tape deck on, but Cathy shouted through the bedroom wall to turn it off. It was way too late at night. Grudgingly, she imagined, he did. Shortly afterwards, she heard him going into the bathroom. Then the tap came on. Thankfully, she stripped off and climbed into bed. The duvet, having been left rolled back for the last 20 minutes, had aired itself nicely and was deliciously soft and warm. It didn't seem quite so frightening out there now, she reflected, switching off her bedside light and snuggling down. Not now that she'd been out and experienced it for herself. It was just another town at midnight. Nobody around, everything at peace. It made a healthy change, let's face it. Cathy felt sleep stealing over her in that old, luxurious way. She moaned softly to herself. Next door, Michael turned over in bed, the springs creaking. But no, that had to be wrong. Surely she could still hear him in the bathroom, washing his hands. It was a real scrub-up, too, by the sounds of it. What was he trying to do? She wondered dreamily. Sterilize them?